What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets late-night television's most notorious liberal host? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. This is the explosive confrontation that had CBS executives scrambling and left audiences stunned into silence. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of The Late Show started innocently enough. Stephen Colbert bounded onto the stage with his trademark smirk, that familiar gleam in his eye that regular viewers know means trouble is brewing. The audience was electric with anticipation as they welcomed the 94-year-old Hollywood icon Clint Eastwood, who walked out slowly but with unmistakable presence, wearing a simple black jacket and jeans, his weathered face betraying nothing of what was about to come. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Clint Eastwood," Colbert announced with exaggerated enthusiasm, gesturing toward his guest as the crowd erupted in applause. Eastwood raised his hand in a brief wave, settling into the guest chair with the careful movements of a man who'd seen nearly a century of life. "Mr. Eastwood, it's an honor to have you here," Colbert began, leaning forward with that practiced television charm. "I have to say, at 94, you're still making movies, still directing, still acting. What keeps you going?" Eastwood's response was measured, his voice carrying that distinctive rasp that had intimidated outlaws on screen for decades. "Well, Stephen, I suppose it's the same thing that's kept me going my whole life. I don't quit when there's work to be done." The audience appreciated the response, but those paying close attention could already sense something in Colbert's demeanor shifting. His smile seemed more forced. His next question loaded with subtext that anyone familiar with his political leanings could recognize. "Speaking of not quittin', you've been pretty vocal about your political views over the years. In fact, you spoke at the Republican National Convention back in 2012, had that famous conversation with an empty chair representing President Obama. Looking back, do you have any regrets about that moment?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Eastwood's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "No regrets, Stephen. I said what I felt needed to be said. Sometimes you have to call things as you see them, whether people like it or not." Right, Colbert nodded. But there was a condescending edge creeping into his tone. "But surely you can understand how some people might have seen that as, well, a bit unusual. Talking to an empty chair on national television? Unusual?" Eastwood's voice carried just a hint of steel now. "What's unusual is thinking that because someone's in the entertainment business, they should keep their mouth shut about the direction of their country." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they'd expected. Colbert's laugh felt forced as he pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the warning signs that anyone who'd watched Eastwood's films would have recognized. "Well, I certainly respect your right to speak your mind. But let's talk about your new project. You're working on another film, and I understand it deals with some pretty heavy themes about American values. Are you concerned that younger audiences might not connect with those traditional values you often explore?" The word traditional seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Eastwood leaned back slightly, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Traditional values? You mean like hard work, personal responsibility, standing up for what's right? Yeah, I'm real worried that young people might not want to hear about those things." There was an unmistakable sarcasm in his voice that made several audience members chuckle nervously. Colbert, however, seemed to interpret this as an opening rather than a warning. "But don't you think some of those traditional values might be holding us back? I mean, we're living in 2025, and maybe it's time to embrace more progressive ideas about how society should work." The silence that followed was deafening. Eastwood stared at his host for what felt like an eternity, his pale blue eyes boring into Colbert with an intensity that could have melted steel. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Progressive ideas? You mean like teaching kids they can't succeed without government help? Like telling people they're victims instead of encouraging them to take control of their own lives?" Colbert's composure began to crack slightly. "Well, I think what progressives are saying is that we need to acknowledge systemic inequalities and—" "Systemic inequalities," Eastwood interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut through Colbert's explanation. "You know what I call systemic inequality? When someone works their ass off their whole life and gets told they didn't build what they built. When someone serves their country and comes home to be lectured by people who've never been in a real fight in their lives. The studio audience was completely silent now, caught between two titans who clearly had no intention of backing down. Colbert's face flushed red as he realized this interview was spiraling completely out of his control. But his ego wouldn't let him retreat. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, I think you're oversimplifying some very complex social issues. We can't just pretend that privilege and structural advantages don't exist. Eastwood's jaw tightened, and those who knew his films could practically hear the whistle of a tumbleweed blowing through the studio. But this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally began to boil over as Eastwood leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless showdowns in his movies. Privilege? You want to talk about privilege, Stephen? Let me tell you about privilege. Colbert shifted uncomfortably, perhaps finally recognizing that he'd pushed too far, but his arrogance wouldn't let him back down. Please, enlighten us, he said with that smug smile that his liberal audience usually ate up. Privilege is sitting in a television studio, making millions of dollars, telling working people how they should think, Eastwood said, his words cutting through the air like bullets. Privilege is never having to worry about your next meal while lecturing others about sharing. Privilege is having security guards while telling law-abiding citizens they don't need guns to protect themselves. The audience was completely frozen now, some looking around nervously as if they were witnessing something they shouldn't be seeing. Colbert's face went from red to pale as he realized this wasn't going according to his usual script of making conservative guests look foolish. Now wait just a minute, Colbert started. But Eastwood wasn't finished. No, you wait a goddamn minute, Eastwood snapped, his famous composure finally cracking. I've been listening to your bullshit for the last 10 minutes. And frankly, I'm getting tired of it. You invited me on this show, so you're going to hear what I have to say. The studio cameras kept rolling, but you could practically feel the production team behind the scenes panicking. This wasn't the sanitized political theater they were used to orchestrating. This was raw, unfiltered truth. And it was happening live. Colbert tried to regain control, his voice taking on that condescending tone he reserved for guests he thought he could steamroll. Mr. Eastwood, I think you're getting a little worked up over nothing. We're just having a conversation about different perspectives. Different perspectives? Eastwood laughed. But there was no humor in it. Is that what you call it when you ambush someone with loaded questions designed to make them look like a fool? Different fucking perspectives? The F-bomb dropped like a nuclear explosion in the pristine CBS studio. Several audience members gasped audibly, and somewhere in the control room, executives were probably reaching for their emergency protocols. But Eastwood wasn't done. You know what your problem is, Stephen? You think because you can make jokes and get applause from a bunch of people who already agree with you, that makes you some kind of moral authority. But you're just another Hollywood elitist who's never had dirt under his fingernails. Colbert's mask was completely off now, his face twisted with anger and embarrassment. How dare you come on my show and attack me personally? I've been nothing but respectful. Respectful? Eastwood interrupted, his voice rising to a level that made everyone in the studio sit up straight. You call it respectful to mock a man's political beliefs? To suggest that values that built this country are somehow outdated and need to be thrown away? The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing, facing each other across the interview desk like gunfighters at high noon. Colbert, despite being decades younger, looked genuinely intimidated by the 94-year-old legend, who seemed to grow more formidable with each passing second. Those values you're talking about, Colbert shot back, his voice shaking slightly, include things like denying people their rights, like keeping people in poverty, like what? Like expecting people to work for what they get? Like believing that actions have consequences? Like thinking that maybe, just maybe, people are responsible for their own damn lives? Eastwood's voice boomed through the studio with such force that several people in the front row actually leaned back in their seats. The exchange was becoming increasingly personal, with decades of cultural and political resentment bubbling to the surface. Colbert, realizing he was losing control of his own show, made the mistake that would seal his fate. Listen, old man, he said, his words dripping with contempt. Maybe it's time you accepted that the world has moved on from your outdated way of thinking. This isn't 1950 anymore. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the hum of the studio lights. Eastwood stood perfectly still, his pale eyes locked on Colbert's face, with an intensity that seemed to physically push the host backward. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have managed. "Old man," he repeated slowly, each word deliberate and loaded with decades of accumulated authority. "You just made a very big mistake, Stephen." The studio atmosphere had become suffocating. Even the camera operators seemed frozen as they witnessed what was unfolding before them. Colbert, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of his error, tried to backtrack with a nervous laugh that fooled no one. "Look, I didn't mean," he started, but Eastwood cut him off with a look that could have stopped a freight train. "No, you meant exactly what you said," Eastwood growled, his voice carrying the weight of every tough guy character he'd ever played. "But this was no performance. You think because I'm 94 years old, I'm some doddering fool you can push around for your little comedy show. You think you can disrespect me in front of millions of people and I'll just sit here and take it." The legendary actor took a step closer to Colbert, who instinctively backed away until he was pressed against his own desk. The audience watched in stunned silence as Hollywood royalty delivered what would become one of the most memorable verbal beatdowns in television history. "Let me educate you about something, you arrogant piece of shit," Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the full force of his fury. "I've been making movies since before you were born. I've directed films that will be remembered long after your pathetic late-night show is forgotten. And I've earned every goddamn bit of respect I get." Colbert's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. His usual arsenal of smug comebacks had completely abandoned him in the face of Eastwood's righteous anger. The host who built his career on making others look foolish was now experiencing what it felt like to be on the receiving end. "But more importantly," Eastwood pressed on, his finger now pointing directly at Colbert's chest, "I've lived through things you couldn't even imagine. I've seen this country at its best and its worst. I've watched men die for the freedoms you take for granted while you sit here making jokes." The production team was frantically trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Should they cut to commercial? Should they try to intervene? But everyone seemed paralyzed by the sheer force of Eastwood's presence and the historical magnitude of what they were witnessing. "You want to know what's really outdated?" Eastwood asked, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. "It's spoiled brats like you, who think they can lecture their betters without consequences. It's people who've never built anything, never created anything lasting, thinking they have the right to tear down what others have accomplished." Colbert finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a squeak. "Mr. Eastwood, please, let's just calm down and—" "Calm down?" Eastwood's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You insult me on national television, question my values, mock my beliefs, call me an old man, and now you want me to calm down? Fuck that. And fuck you." The expletive hit the studio like a lightning bolt. Several audience members actually stood up, unsure whether to applaud or run for the exits. This was television history being made, raw and unfiltered, in a way that simply didn't happen on major networks anymore. Eastwood straightened his jacket with deliberate precision, his movements controlled and purposeful. "You know what, Stephen? I've had enough of this bullshit. I came here to talk about my work, maybe share some stories with your audience. But instead, you decided to turn this into some kind of political ambush." He turned toward the audience, his voice carrying clearly through the studio, without need for amplification. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this sorry excuse for journalism. You deserve better than having your intelligence insulted by this clown." The audience didn't know how to react. Some clapped hesitantly, others sat in stunned silence. But all of them understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Colbert, desperate to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his show, made one final, fatal attempt to regain control. "Security!" he called out, his voice cracking with panic and humiliation. Eastwood turned back to him with a look of pure contempt. "Security? You're going to call security on a 94-year-old man because he hurt your feelings? That's exactly the kind of coward I thought you were." Before anyone could respond, Eastwood began walking toward the exit with the same measured pace he'd used to enter. But he wasn't finished. At the edge of the stage, he stopped and delivered his final verdict on Stephen Colbert and everything he represented. "You want to know what's wrong with this country?" he called back, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "It's people like you who think they're smart, but have no wisdom, who think they're funny but have no character, who think they're important but contribute nothing of value." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the knockout punch. "I've been in this business for 70 years, Stephen. I've seen performers come and go, and let me tell you something. You're going to be forgotten long before I am. Not because of my age, but because I stand for something, and you stand for nothing but your own ego." With that, Clint Eastwood walked off the Late Show stage and into television legend, leaving behind a stunned host, a shell-shocked audience, and what would become the most talked-about late-night television moment in history. Colbert stood alone at his desk, his face red with embarrassment and fury, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The cameras finally cut to commercial, but the damage was done. In less than 20 minutes, a 94-year-old Hollywood legend had single-handedly destroyed the credibility of one of late-night television's biggest names, and the entire world had watched it happen. The man with no name had spoken, and his words would echo through the entertainment industry for years to come.